I want to talk about Bravely Default 2, but more importantly, I really want to talk about its art style, as well as a few other things that worry me about the game as well. However, as of right now, I can't really comment on stuff such as the game's story, characters and gameplay, etc. As of this recording, the game is currently not out yet. Which is why I want to talk about the game's general presentation, as it's something I can critique, and I have some feelings on the matter. Before we begin, I just want to say that I loved the first two Bravely games. I loved everything from the game's art style, to the characters, to the job system. In fact, I loved it so much when I first got Default, I quickly racked up about 35 hours of play in just 5 days. So of course, when the oddly named Bravely Default 2 was announced, I was absolutely overjoyed. From just the first few notes of the new theme at the beginning of the announcement trailer, I could already tell what it was. Then there was this lovely piece of art in the art team's signature style, a bunch of overviews of various pre-rendered towns in a very similar aesthetic to the first two games, and then the trailer capped off by showing the 4 party members' 3D models standing by a cliffside. It was the next day upon rewatching the trailer, however, was when I started to get twangs of worry. There was just something about these characters that seemed off. At first I thought it was just Elvis in the back there clashing with the look of the other 3, but it wasn't just him that bothered me, it was all of them. And it wasn't just me who felt this way. Over the last year, I began to see several people online saying how they felt the same about the game just looking kind of off. But it was also something I couldn't really find a joint consensus on why people felt like this. There were various takes such as, oh, the chibi art style just doesn't upscale well to HD, or, oh, maybe they just don't have that big a budget, to the much more defensive, no, it looks fine, you just want generic realistic graphics. And so everything I found wasn't really useful to me. Now, as I've mentioned, I absolutely love the look of the first two games, and if we ever got a remake of Final Fantasy V, I think it would be a perfect fit for that game's campy, light-hearted feel, especially since the Bravely games are basically a spiritual successor to FF5's job system. So I desperately wanted to know what exactly I felt was wrong with the look of Bravely Default 2. I started by seeing how the 3DS games would look at 1080p by running them in an emulator, and surprise surprise, they look great. The models are fairly low poly for HD resolutions, as are some of the textures, but the visual style is still on point and would look absolutely amazing if just cleaned up a little bit. After playing the final demo and thinking about it for a while, I realised that there were 2 major points where I think Bravely Default 2's visual problems stem from, and that's the proportion of the characters and the game's use of Unreal Engine 4's effects and features. I'll start with the proportions because it's personally the main reason for me. The reason why the chibi character models don't work in 3D argument doesn't hold water is because in this case it's actually the opposite. If you compare the models of the lead characters in each game, you can see that the proportions have steadily gotten more and more realistic and less chibi over time. If we use the universal anime measurement of character heads, you can see that the general height of characters from game to game has increased. This works really well for Bravely Second, as there is a 2-year time skip since the previous game, and decreasing the size of a character's head but having them maintain mostly the same height is a good way of displaying subtle growth in younger characters, both emotionally and physically. Another good example of how this same tweak to proportions is applied is in the follow-up comics to Avatar: The Last Airbender. Taking place 1 year after the series finale, the artists make similar adjustments to the character proportions, reducing the head size by 15% and making some minor adjustments, but otherwise keeping everything the same. So why doesn't this work for Bravely Default 2? Well, I believe there's actually a number of things that nudge the character models closer and closer into Uncanny Valley. Firstly, while it's not a huge jump, there is a further height increase. However, this time around, it has nothing to do with showing the passage of time, as these are all brand new characters. It's also something that applies to all of the characters, including the asterisk holders, who were already taller to begin with. While most of the asterisk holders in Bravely Second kept the same proportions from Bravely Default, as those were adults and would not have grown in the 2-year time skip. What really makes a difference and emphasises the height increase though, is that all of this extra height is put into the arms and legs of the characters. And that's what starts making the character proportions stop being cute and starts moving them towards being unsettling. The dev team probably did this to make use of the Switch's stronger hardware, as now they can push character models with more polygons. But the end result, in my opinion, ends up just feeling kinda wrong. For the other thing that makes the character models look off, we need to look towards the art team. Now, I'm not saying any of this is the art team's fault, in fact, quite the opposite. Akihiko Yoshida may no longer be the lead artist anymore, like he was on the first 2 Bravely games, but he did do the character designs, and while I don't know the specifics of who's working in the art team, I do know that it's being headed by Naoki Ikushima, just as Octopath was before. And Ikushima was part of the art team that worked on the first 2 Bravely games, so Bravely Default 2's key and concept art still retains that signature style that Yoshida has influenced over the years with the Ivalice Final Fantasy games. The thing is, Akihiko Yoshida is a cultured man, with a passion for thighs and a phobia of noses, and the severe lack of any smelling organ is a signature aspect of that art style. I'm not saying that characters can't have noses to look good, I mean, just look at Final Fantasy XII and Vagrant Story, and you can see that those games look great. But the difference in those games is that they're trying to go for a more realistic look, while Bravely Default is not. And while it's subtle, the fact that every character now has a nose just looks weird, as it's moving away from that intended super deformed look. And I know there's a few characters in the original, like Barus the Monk and the Black Mage Ominous Crow, who have noses show up on their character models, but the fact is, these characters are exceptions to the rule, and not the default. And while most of the art we've seen does actually show the characters with noses, these pieces are supposed to be more accurate representations of the characters than the way that the game is supposed to be presenting them. Even Final Fantasy Tactics kept noses out of their animated cutscenes, despite those designs being more realistically proportioned compared to how Bravely Default has them. Now on to the second thing, which is less of a problem and more of a bizarre choice, and that's the way that the game handles various parts of Unreal Engine 4. Now, I'm not a game designer, but I have watched a few videos from Digital Foundry, so clearly I might as well be an expert in the field. But in all seriousness, I do sort of know what's affecting what on the technical side, so still hear me out. The game's use of lighting and materials, which are what makes the character models reflect light in different ways, makes the game have this almost plastic toy-like look to it. Now, this may be what they were trying to go with, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. The Bravely games haven't been afraid of weird design choices, such as most of the Baals from Bravely 2nd actually being made up of random things that the art teams could find in their homes, instead of just being drawn up, resulting in these weird, horrifying, but also really interesting looking monster designs. However, I can't help but feel that this toy look wasn't intentional, and if it was, then I don't think it was executed very well, which is unfortunate. I don't like how things like metal armor looks like it's just made of plastic but painted with matte silver paint instead. I don't think something like cell shading would have necessarily been the correct way to go with this, but some sort of flatter lighting solution would have at least looked better in my opinion. But what do I know? I'm just some nerd who likes to talk about video games, don't listen to me. To be honest, I am worried that I'm just being a bit overly negative about everything. I mean, it's not like it looks like that awful puzzle fighter game for mobile that Capcom released a few years ago. And I know everything I've been saying is incredibly nitpicky, but I do know that I'm not the only one who thinks this. There's been a lot about the game that I've been worried about. Like, not long after the game was announced, there was a Famitsu interview with the game's producer apologising for Bravely 2nd's quality, which I was extremely confused by, especially since the details were so vague of what he was actually apologising for. For the most part, outside of a few things like the game's tone being a bit different from the first, and the composer Revo, who did all the music for the first game, was not part of the second, my impression of the public opinion of Bravely 2nd was that it was mostly positive. So I'm worried that what he was apologising for was stuff that I liked about the first 2 games. One other thing that worries me is that while it's the same team from Square that's worked on all the Bravely games and Octopath, there's actually been 3 other dev teams that have been the majority of the manpower on the 4 projects, and I'm worried that Silicon Studio actually played a bigger part in making the first 2 games as good as they were, since the reaction to Octopath Traveler was pretty mixed, but I can't really say whether or not that's the case. One last thing I want to say is that while I realised it was an early build of the game, the first demo did not fill me with a ton of confidence. there was a lot of changes that I was unsure on, and navigating the game's menus was hell, which is an area you definitely want to be up to snuff in a classic style RPG, since you'll be spending a lot of time in those menus. Now, a fair few of my gripes were solved with the more recent demo that they put out, but there were still a few things, like character stats only appearing in the equipment menu when hovering over something else to equip, and then disappearing for no reason when backing out to the main part of the equipment menu. And like other RPGs, you can use L and R to rotate between characters in the menus, but for some reason this doesn't always work in certain submenus when you're in them. And on top of all of that, there seems to still be some input delay, or rather, the game freezes up sometimes when changing between tabs in the menu. It all seems very inconsistent and clunky still, and since the game's probably going to be about 40 to 70 hours long, wrestling with the menus for all of that time does not sound like it would be fun. There were, to be fair, a few things that I did enjoy, however. The pre-rendered towns took a bit of a sidestep, as they don't look quite as good as they did before, as they're no longer entirely pre-rendered art pieces, but they have still kept that look for the most part. And the new changes allow for a more dynamic camera, which gives for a slightly different feel when exploring the towns. Something else that I like quite a bit is that even on the normal difficulty, the boss battles that you go up against still seem pretty challenging. And I like the idea of the game actually pushing you to abuse the job system to get by, as creating overpowered wacky builds, like a Dark Knight that heals themselves with Drainblade, is one of the best things about having the FF5/tactic style job system in a game. So here's hoping that that part of the demo is representative of the final product. Oh, and one last thing before I wrap all of this up. I just want to say, if you are excited about Bravely Default 2, then more power to you. The last thing I want to do is to be telling people not to enjoy the game. This video was more just to help sort my own feelings out on the matter, as well as help others who also felt unsure about how the game looked, but didn't quite understand why. I know this video has been pretty negative for the most part, but I am still genuinely excited for the game. I just have some very tempered expectations, and honestly, looking at things like the hype for Cyberpunk, it's not really